Welcome. We're going to be working on lessons 11 and 12 tonight. All right. All right, modern translations. We got past the textual criticism. We're going to talk about this a number of times, and so I'm just going to pass right on through. April had the answer to this question, which was we're looking for people that are looking for the original text. That's what text critics do. That's what textual criticism is, and so that is the important thing, because always remember, the inspired word is the original word, not the translated words. Okay, so we got to always keep that in mind. So we always have to keep our mind going back, thinking back to the original, and the things we're going to talk about tonight makes a big difference in trying to find out that original. So, this is something that has a lot of people afraid until they get into it and start understanding it a little bit. And so this is an important topic. Textual variants. What is a textual variant? Or something that is different.
And maybe it's a verse or a set of words that appears in a text that may be found in one version of the text, but not in another.
Okay, right. So if you remember, we had 5,800 manuscripts. Okay, if you looked into the book of Mark and you looked into chapter 15 of Mark those New Testament manuscripts, and you look at verse 35 and you look word for word on there, you would. I mean, in an ideal world of perfect humans who copied all that stuff, every one of those words would be the same all the way through. But they're not. And so we're going to take a look at this and see why. It's basically just a text. One text differs from another text in some way. Okay? So how do textual variants impact our modern translations? What would you think? First of all, do we have the original texts anywhere? No. Okay. Those are gone, long ago. Okay. Although the people that were copying the originals had the originals as it started off and it went through the years, and then eventually we're getting to copies that are still available to us today. Okay, that we're looking back and seeing how far back do these things go ultimately. Because it was somebody that looked at an original, copied it, and then somebody maybe they didn't see the original, maybe they just saw your copy. How good a copier were you would be the question. Well, that's why we did all that previous study, talking about how meticulous a lot of those copiers were, and that was important. So we have there's no original witnesses in producing these original texts, and I'll call them at this point critical texts, not to be confused with the critical text, specifically the critical text, which is that New Testament document that is used today. But I call it critical from the standpoint that somebody is trying to go out and get as close to the original text as possible. That's their goal, okay? And so it's critical you get that right if it's going to be helpful. All right, so we're looking at that, trying to do that. The thing that gets in the way of people in their minds is this idea that the greater the number of manuscripts, okay, the greater the number of variants it's possible to be. If you only had one manuscript, one copy of whatever it is that you're doing, Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and you only had one copy, and one copy was the only one that was ever made, and you were looking at it today, there could still be an error from the copier, not falling asleep, not enough coffee, he didn't, I mean, it's possible that he could have done something that made it different from the original, okay? And you say, wow, that's bad. What if it was significant? If it was significant, that would be bad. But we're going to find out that in most cases, it's things that you can look at and say, oh, I know why he did that. Okay. So, anyway, the number of manuscripts, which creates a huge number of variants, really is not a factor. And I'll show you why in just a second. Okay? So, the third question is, what are the three most common categories of variants and their significance in creating this critical text? Okay, what would be one of the things that somebody could get wrong when they're copying things? Spelling. How many are great spellers in here? Okay. Now these guys are looking at, let's just take the Greek New Testament, all right? They're looking at majuscule, no differences, you know. There's no blanks in there. That's just, you know, block letter after block letter after block letter as you're going through and everything. They had to have a lot of different ways of checking things, and we found out that they did have a lot of ways of checking things. But it could be easy to misspell something. Something could be misspelled because it's just transcribed wrong. It could be maybe the same word, it's just spelled a different way. It's possible you could have, we have it in English where you have the same English word and you could spell it two different ways. I don't know how many, you know, when it comes to names, for instance, you know, Jon is John. John is John. Johnny is still John, you know, and all of those things. So spelling differences, 98% or more of the variants that we find are this variant. And that's why we call it insignificant, because we can look at it and see what they transposed the letters. This guy was dyslexic. This guy just used an alternate spelling, etc. Okay, so we got that. The second one is a little bit more, but again, something that we can look at and say, oh, I can understand that, why it happened. And that is when a word or a phrase is omitted or added or omitted. Okay, either way, it's different. Okay, from another text. Now, examples, for instance. One of the ways that the back in the early days, before the 1600s, when they were copying these things by hand, and before they're publishing them on the printing presses, all right? Printing presses bring other things into factors depending on what the typesetter does, right? Okay, but we're talking about hand copying. They would get somebody in a room like this, and you guys are all scribes, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you the text, and you're going to write it down as I read it to you, okay? And with that in mind, there was a little bit of, again, for the different scribes, some were a little bit more, stronger on saying that's exactly what he said. What he meant, Todd says, what he meant to say was, for instance, Jesus. I said Jesus. He says Christ. He writes Jesus. You write Christ. You know, is it the same person? Yes, it is. Okay, so that makes it insignificant as far as a difference, and you can usually see based on that guy that wrote, the guy that wrote Christ all the time, he wrote Christ all the time. And the guy that wrote Jesus, he wrote Jesus. Just for an example. The commandment of God versus the word of God. Again, different thing, but it means the same thing. Okay? So again, it comes down to the individual scribe. But when you're talking about capturing the essence of the word, it's still, you have the essence of what God's word is meant to be, is still there. And so this is where you get into the difference between, as we're going to talk about majority texts, critical texts, and things like that. One of the things that brings the majority text into this is how many times is it Jesus? Whereas how many times is it Christ? Oh, 1 out of 15 in the room wrote Christ, and everybody else wrote Jesus. I think the guy said Jesus instead of Christ. And so I choose Jesus as the guy putting the critical text together as the word that was used in there. And then that goes into the manuscript. You see how that works? Okay, it's just the human process of going through it. Okay. This last one, though, is the one that is what we would call significant. And let's take a look at this one. The section omission. And before we were talking about a word or a phrase. Now we're talking about a section. And we'll give a couple of examples here in a second. There are only a few of these. Less than 1% of the variants that are out there are of this kind. And so it's important that we look at these kinds and be aware when they occur and where they occur so that we can get what the alternate versions of them are, so that we can make decisions ourselves as the readers as to basically whether or not this is something I'm going to accept. Do I need this particular thing, for et cetera. All of that is in there. The one thing you need to know, and that's why it says here, but still not that significant, is that of all of these less than 1% of the variants that are out there, these section omissions, none of them, the word that I used is none of them have any impact on the faith itself. In other words, they're coming up, these are sections that are where whatever it is that they're talking about is talked about someplace else, or something like that, where you have sufficient information already available to you, whether or not the text is inserted or not inserted, won't ultimately make a difference in the doctrine that's there. That's important. And we're going to take a look at a couple of these. All right. Two of the most significant ones that are used or seen the most often are John 7, verse 53 through 8:11. It's the woman caught in adultery. And the reason that this one falls into this category is that earlier manuscripts like the Codex Sinaiticus don't have this particular story in there. Some of them have this, but they put it in a different place. Now, you can see why that would happen. Somebody finds a manuscript and they find a piece of a manuscript. And the piece of the manuscript includes, say, this particular section. But they don't know necessarily where that section goes because it's only a fragment of it. And so some people may put it here, some people may put it there. But ultimately, whether it's put it here, there, or it's included or not included at all, this particular account, whether it's in or out, has no impact at all on the doctrine associated with what Jesus is talking about here. Okay, so again, it's a nice story that's there, and you can consider it for it being there. We're going to talk about why it's important that you know the difference in just a couple of minutes. The second one is Mark 16, verses 9 through 20, the Great Commission and the miracles that are talked about as far as later on in the New Testament. And again, this is one of those things where, and I've got both of these, I've got a New American Standard and a New King James up here, okay? Now, how many of you have a New King James in there? Okay. If it has a middle section in it, what you're going to see is a note or a reference that's in there, and it will talk to you about this particular thing. What mine says is, for verse 53, chapter 7, verse 53, it says a big N and a big U, and it says this section is in brackets from 753 through 811 is not in the original text. There are, at present, over 900 texts which it is included in, okay? So what that's given you is an idea, an indicator, as you're reading in your Bible for this particular section, what you have to consider. Now, if you go to the New American Standard, you've got a similar, which comes from a different place. We'll talk about this in a little bit. A different source, all right, if I might use it in that way, as far as the critical text. Over here in Mark chapter 16, for instance, it has a note over there starting in verse 9, and it's got the little brackets around it. And starting in verse 9, and the note says, later manuscripts add these verses. Okay, so now we're talking about for here, the later manuscripts, these are not included in the originals of this in the New King James, which means these new discoveries that are made of these very old ones, they don't have it in there, but the newer ones do, and then vice versa on the other side. Basically, this is included in one set of manuscripts, but not included in another. And so you go, so which one should I choose? Well, first of all, whether Mark 16 is here, verses 9 through 20 is included or not, again, the doctrines that are talked about here, the Great Commission, all of the stuff associated with that, the acts that are going on at the time, what's told, are all, again, other places in Scripture, okay? So, we don't know specifically whether or not these particular ones that were omitted specifically were omitted and just added later on for clarification by a worthy scribe who felt the need to go ahead and help explain this thing or not, or whether or not it's something that it should be there, but they just, the copies that ended up being made after that, now all of a sudden, it's not there. So you don't know one way or the other. Now, here's the evidence that you have to look at. And when you look, for instance, at the long ending of Mark, you look at the Jesus with the woman taken in adultery, the evidence for is very great in both of these cases. The evidence against is very great for both of these cases. Okay? So these are people who, for instance, the codex is up there. Those are copies that have the text in them. The ones on the right are the copies, for instance, the Codex Babianus and the Sinaitic Syriac and the Codex. Those are copies that did not have it in there, okay? And so you look at that and you go, what do I do? You need to know, again, this information. And it needs to be in front of you so that you can, like the Bereans, go in and see if it's so. Now, we know one thing for sure, and you can nail this down for sure, and that is the idea that there are no conflicts in the Scripture. One thing is not going to conflict with another. None of these conflict with anything, whether they're in or out. So again, it has no impact on the faith or the doctrine at all. And so, yeah, go ahead, Todd.
I'm sorry, I don't have the book with me, but I thought he mentioned that in some cases where it's not included, there is kind of a conspicuous blank space.
Yes.
Were you coming to that?
Well, there's a lot of evidence on all of this, and Todd brings up one of the other points associated with. Jesse's got a bunch of other ones too, but for sake of time, we can't go into all of them. But for instance, yeah, there are blanks where in certain manuscripts that had this missing. Okay, there are blanks for where it should be, which would tell you that you have, for instance, maybe the scribe had a question about this particular section. I got to go check with the head scribe who, should we include it or not include it? Well, let's leave it blank for now and we'll get back to it later on or whatever. I mean, we don't know. The reason these are called viable right there. Okay. Viable and significant. These are viable variants because there's not an easy way of explaining what was in the scribe's mind that caused this. That makes them viable. That means that this is something you need to know about. And significant is just that it's a major deviation from the text. From that text to this text, okay? From that location to this location, there's a significant and those two things are important for you to know. And then you need to factor that in to your reading and to your study to be able to understand that, which is one of the reasons we're going through this class. So, all right, so down here at the bottom, this is just a note to make you go into other places. The NU part, which we talked about earlier, this basically is an abbreviation for what is, in fact, the new critical text that is used. And the new critical text that's used is the Nestle Aland Greek New Testament, which is what the N stands for, and the United Bible Society's third edition, which is what the U stands for. And so for their source document, that critical text, which is updated all the time by these same folks, okay, that's the one that they are updating and using in there. And so we'll get into how you factor all that in later on. But again, you need to just know about these things. There's so few of them. There's two to three that are significant that you need to know about. And again, none of them have anything to do with, if they're not in there, it's not going to change anything as far as the faith. Baptism is still going to be baptism, and it's necessary for whatever it is if you don't have Mark 16 in there, okay? But it's also a great story, and if you do have it in there. So if it's supposed to be there, it's good. If it's not there, it has no impact. Okay, so that's the thing you need to remember. Okay, so again, a lot of evidence for Bible manuscripts. We're just going to kind of skip over this section fairly quickly. Again, it's in the way of review. It's important that you know which textual criticism is being used here. So for the Old Testament, we could see, we talked about this before. The New Testament, you could see, again, what you could either use the one, the other, or a combination of both, which is the best way to do it, the combination of both. And all the modern translations use the combination of both. Okay, so the eclectic approach, which we'll talk a little bit more. These are the foundations basically for these translations right now. So, of the choosing of the critical text, okay, for the New Testament, or the Textus Receptus and the majority text, you can see which translations start with that foundation, okay? The ones we're most familiar with here are all kind of listed here, all right? And there is a difference in the King James, New King James, which uses the Textus Receptus as its primary source, but it doesn't use it as its full source like the original one did. It uses it as just the starting point, whereas all the ones on the left use as a starting point the critical text, which uses the oldest, the Codex Sinaiticus and all of those, uses that as its starting point. And then they go to the other, and they're all a combination of the two. Okay, go ahead.
Those two groups I think are good to keep in mind, because when you're doing some word study, if you're comparing translations and they're all in the same column on the left, well, that's like comparing the same thing to itself. Right. But it's good to look at both, and that way we don't have the Textus Receptus to go look at, or we could if we were Greek scholars, I guess. But you can go look at the New King James and the New American Standard to see, okay, here's two possible renderings of
the same thing.
What can I learn from that?
Exactly, and it comes from two different beginning points. But isn't it amazing how similar even those two different points are, how similar they are in their reading and the way they ultimately come out? And that's because, again, they're not just looking at two standalone documents. They're looking at the compilation of much work and study that's gone on over the years. I just want to make two quick points on these new things, and that is how close we have now shrunk the window between when the first copies were made and the last originals were made. Okay, it used to be the gap was pretty big. This was talking about a New Testament one, P46. That means the P stands for papyrus. It's the 46th find here, so that's why it's P46. This particular find comes from it dates back to the 100 to 200 time frame AD. Okay, so when did the New Testament writers, John, finish up the book of John? Yeah, 90, 90, this comes from 100, You see how close we are to the, yeah, it's very close. Now, an interesting point, and then we'll leave this one, was that this was a compilation of Paul's writings. Sections of Romans, Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, and 1 Thessalonians. It's interesting that the person that put this gathering of things together back in 100 AD thought that Paul wrote Hebrews because he included it with the Pauline letters, which was unusual. Usually they sent these out either separate or the full book. Okay, so that kind of gives the nose to the folks that talk about Paul today not writing Hebrews, but we still don't know for sure because there's no author to it. But this guy here from 100 AD was pretty convinced by it and included him in that. So this gap is down under 50 years now for the New Testament. Now, what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? We've talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls before. This is like one of the caves it was in. The scrolls were in this kind of shape up here. These are other scrolls that were found in the same kinds of locations. So you see how they had to take really good care of them. But the Dead Sea Scrolls were basically in the 100 BC to 70 AD is the time frame in there. And the reason that these were important, for a lot of different reasons, they matched the Masoretic text, which showed how well the Masoretes had, put this kind of stuff together all the way through, well past it. But this got the time frame gap down to 300 years, from 1,300 years to 300 years for the Old Testament. Now, that's pretty good. 300 years. Remember, the Malachi ended up about 400 BC, and now we're looking at 100 BC right here for this. So that was pretty good. But then you got to think about the silver scroll pendant, which was found not too much later. In 1979, they found this in an old city in Jerusalem, and they found on it, over on the right side, the text right here of Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. Now, this metallurgy on the metal piece up here, they can get pretty accurate on the date based on the metallurgy that they do and what we could do today. They found that to be 600 BC. Well, when did Malachi finish writing up? 400. We're not at zero here. We've got active evidence of copies of Old Testament Scripture 200 years before the end of the inspired word. So the Old Testament is sitting at zero, and the New Testament is under 50. I mean, you remember from before those texts about Plato and all that, and the gaps in there. So if that doesn't help you, I mean, these people that come up with this stuff about it's 1,000 years between the earliest copies. Nah, archaeology continues to bring out the facts of the Bible. Okay, what are some factors that give us great confidence in the reliability of the biblical text. Thinking about all the things we talked about, what are some things that build up your confidence in that? Daniel?
That there are so many copies that, some of the famous documents we would say are authentic today don't even have that many copies.
Okay, so large number of manuscripts, huge number, massive amount of information, more than any, not even close to any of the other ancient books. And with God's providence, that's what you would expect, isn't it? And they keep finding more. All right, so what is something else we talked about just now? We talked about that gap. The gap between when the original letter was written and the first copy was made. Yeah.
Very short gap.
Yeah, we're talking, very short. Very short. Little if no gap at all there. And then, of course, you got to bring this in, consistency of the copied texts. Even when you're looking at it from two different sources, 1,200 years apart as a starting point, and you bring all of that together from the East and from the West, and you bring it all together, and you come up with two different English translations right here from two different original sources, and we can sit right here and put the New King James on the screen, and you can be reading the New American Standard down there in your pew, and you can understand both of them the same. That's beautiful. That's God at work, okay? So that's consistency. And of course, all we're finding is the modern discoveries just keep validating the amazing consistency. The older the documents we're finding, the better the 12th, 13th, and 14th century copies are looking over in another part of the world, okay? All right, so let's move on here to the thing you've all been waiting for, choosing a translation. All right, so simply put, why are there different translations of the Bible? It is actually fairly simple. Jesse says money. That has a lot to do with it. Publishing houses. These are competing publishing houses that made these books. Okay, but who has the biggest say in what is going to be in this English translation? What group of folks?
Translation.
The translators, yeah, the ones doing the translation. They have their decisions that they make are critical to what ends up in the translation, okay? So we got all these things. What approach to textual criticism? What style of translation? We haven't talked about style yet. We're going to talk about that. And then do we need to update the language at all, even? Okay? Now, I put this one in. This is a freebie, okay? Doctrinal perspective. Do not ever think that there is an unbiased, completely unbiased person doing this work out there. We all have biases, okay? So it's the translation is a man-made document, and so we've got to realize that there is going to be possibly an influence in there. We need to watch out for it. Now, some translations and some other documents, books that are written in the English language that supposedly come from the Bible can be very obvious as to what they think. But we need to be aware that it could be. Yeah, Jesse?
I have used a lot of versions. The problem we got in English and in America is copyrights. And if somebody wants to copyright a new version or a new edition, there has to be certain percentage of variance in other publications or it's plagiarism.
Right.
And you can only do that so many times before there's too much nuance and there's too much watered down, which is again why you'd almost always want, like you're talking about, a parallel or something that does a comparison.
Yeah.
Because it may not be intentional, but they essentially have to.
But it's there. We just need to be aware of it. You are going to come out of this class now aware, eyes wide open on these selections and these documents, and that's important. That's what we're trying to get. It's important that you clearly understand the translator's decisions before selecting a translation. All the good translations have a front section, like this New King James does, preface up here. Beautiful 3 pages of explanation on what this course was about. and it's really, you need to read it and read it, learn it, love it, live it. I mean that, because they're giving you all the information as to where they got their stuff. All right, so the translator has 3 decisions to make. Decision number 1, what is his approach to textual criticism? We talked about this before. For the Old Testament, the New Testament, it's still those same decisions. It's either use the accepted text, use the new discoveries, or use a combination of the two. And the best thing is to use the combination of the two, and that's what most of them do now. Translation decision number 2, this is the one we haven't talked about yet. What style of translation do I use? So there are different styles of translation, okay? So what are the 4 different styles of translation? Give me some quick answers here. Styles of translation. What was it?
Paraphrase.
Paraphrase. Okay, we got that one. All right, what other ones do we have?
Word for word.
Word for word. Okay, so that could be interlinear, or what this other one tries to do. What is the one that uses the critical text? What's that one called?
Formal equivalence.
Okay, formal equivalence, and we'll just explain that in a second. And then there's one more,
Dynamic equivalence.
dynamic equivalence. Okay, so that sounds kind of dynamic there. So, and it is. So, all right. So these are the 4 styles of translation. Let's look at them one at a time. Paraphrase, not really a translation. It's more of an extended commentary. Basically, it's not intended. The author of the translation is not intending to grab the original author's exact thoughts and put them over here. His or her method is basically to give me the story, and then I'll tell you what the story said. Okay, so basically, this is the method that's most vulnerable to bias. So again, examples, Living Bible, the Message. I don't recommend these to even have them in the house. Just, these, you might as well just get a commentary and just read that, because it's the same thing. Words of man. Now, the interlinear translation. Now, we were talking about word for word. That's what this one is. It literally is a word, Greek word, Hebrew word, English word over here, one after another. The problem is it's awkward. And this is the other end of the spectrum. Paraphrase is over there. That's the exalted commentary. And then over here you have interlinear, which is word for word for word. The problem is for different languages deal with different words or different grammar structure in different ways. So you got some problems with awkwardness in reading it. It's great for word studies. If you're going to do intense word studies, this is the way to go with this. But and I'll give you just a quick example I was using before class. We got, for instance, languages like Spanish, Korean, and everything. And they put all the important words in the sentence up front. So subject, object. Example being take out the stinky trash. That's what we would say. Take out the stinky trash. In Spanish, it would be take out the trash stinky. Because they load all the descriptors at the end of the thing. And so you go, well, whether it's take out the trash stinky or take out the stinky trash, you can understand what it is. And so the interlinear would go take out the trash stinky, if it's, and then the guys would take it and they'd go, the translators, and they would say, put the stinky in the front, and that's the way that would go. Okay, so that's one of the ways that we do that. Dynamic equivalence. All right, so this one is the thought for thought one. And what they're doing is they're taking like a sentence, getting what the thought of that sentence is, and then providing an English translation of that thought. Now, It's one step removed from the paraphrase, in other words. Okay, the paraphrase was taking even bigger chunks and rephrasing them, but in this particular case, it's a thought for thought as it goes through the sentences. So this one is, because of sentence structure, a lot of times the folks like to use this one because at times the wording can be a little strange and everything, and so they're saying, oh, it'd just be better for me to explain what it is. I know what he's saying, but there's some problems with that in that it opens up, again, the more of your opinion gets inserted in there, the more room there is for bias. So, again, the most common one that we know that uses this style is the New International Version. Okay? And so there's a caution associated with that when we look at the New International Version. Okay, the fourth one is the formal equivalence. And this is the word-for-word translation. However, you can't technically go word for word because of the differences in the grammar and the way the sentences are structured and everything. And so what the formal equivalence tries to do is use word for word where possible, and then when they have to, like the stinky trash and the trash stinky, okay, the formal equivalence would say, I'm going to take the stinky part and I'm going to move it to the front. That's dynamic equivalence at work, okay? You've got that shifting around of the grammar and stuff like that, okay? Now, what formal equivalence does is it moves between the dynamic equivalence, moving the stinky, right, and the interlinear versions, which is word for word for word for word, English, 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 Greek, 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 okay? So that's the difference in those two. And you can see the ones that, this is the one that uses, for the most part, this is gonna be, I mean, other than interlinear gives you literally word for word. So if you want to go with the one that, but you just can't read it because it doesn't make any sense. But this one tries to handle that difference there. Okay, the translator decision number 3 is whether or not to update the language. All of the reasons that these ones here we've got them is because the language was getting so archaic. And so they've done this. However, publications that push social agendas or ones that try to simplify biblical concepts to meet current societal trends can be prone to error. So you got to beware of that particular thing. So if a person is just updating a translation, and here's the example right here. New International Version's coming up with a gender-neutral version of the Bible, okay? And a lot of people are not happy about that, okay? So just beware. That gets into translator decision number 3. So is there one perfect translation? No, there's not. But here's my recommendations, and we got 1 minute to get them. All right, there's 2 things I'd like you to consider in considering all the stuff you learned from the course. And one is to consider the primary sources used by the translators. You now have enough information to be able to do that. And if not, you can read it in your book again. Okay, so what we're looking at is somebody that uses textual criticism of a wide variety, okay? And I would consider that they would want to use the date method, the earliest manuscript being the most accurate. That would be the critical text approach. And then after that, geographic distribution, where is it found, how often is it found, and then basically the number of manuscripts after that. So if you kind of look at that and a priority, if the translators are using that kind of as a way of looking at it, you're probably going to be in good shape with that translation. And then select from a modern formal equivalence translation, something that's modern where you can read it. And the formal equivalence, again, using as the primary means is the word-for-word translation, and then using dynamic equivalence only when the original word order or grammar makes the reading awkward. That's the only time you insert that. Okay, so my recommendation for reading and for studying are really two choices. I've got them both up here right now. It's the New American Standard, which uses the critical text and has the Western priority, and the New King James, which uses the Textus Receptus, which is the Eastern priority. Either one of those would work just fine. Do you need to buy two Bibles? Not necessarily. Okay, you could buy, I've got 20 plus Bibles. Jesse's probably got more. But basically, get yourself a good Bible, one of those two versions, and mark it up good. Make it feel like a comfortable old shoe. It should be something that you feel really comfortable with. And then, when you're in studying, study from your Bible and the opposite of the two here, and have those available. And you can have them available like this, real books, or you can have like one real book and if you're good in electronics, you can have the computer over there. And that's it. Always compare the readings in these two before you study any farther. Always do a comparison for all the reasons we talked about in the class. All right, you guys, thanks a lot. And I enjoyed the class. Hope you guys got a lot out of it.